Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for the launch of the Nuclear Energy Agency flagship report, The Full Costs of Electricity Provision, which examines the costs of the major power generation technologies. Opening remarks today will be made by Mr. William D. Magwood IV, NEA Director General, followed by a presentation of the report by Professor Jan Horst Keppler, Senior Economic Advisor at the NEA and the coordinating author of the report. Jan's intervention will be followed by comments from Kirsty Gogan, co-founder and executive director at Energy for Humanity in London, an NGO working towards enabling universal access to clean and affordable energy. Joining us by video link is Matthew Crozat. Matthew is Senior Director for Policy Development at the Nuclear Energy Institute in Washington, D.C., and long-standing co-chair of the NEA Working Party on Nuclear Energy Economics, which oversaw the work on this study. Following their interventions, we will then take questions from the audience, both here and online. Our panel will do their best to then answer them. For instructions on how to submit your questions, please visit the NEA website at www.oecd-nea.org or send them directly to press@oecd-nea.org. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Magwood. Mr. Magwood, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you joining us this afternoon for the launch of this report, The Full Costs of Electricity Provision. This is a very comprehensive study that covers not just nuclear energy, but renewables, fossil fuel sources, really the broad range of energy technologies, so we can have a full-bodied comparison and calculation of the costs of providing electricity. Let me begin by thanking the speakers with us here today. Who were with us here in Paris, Jan Keppler, who we've already been introduced, and Kirsty Gogan, who also has been introduced, and Matt Crozat, who I'm sorry is not here with us physically, but he is with us online and will be able to respond to questions. He, in particular, Matt, is representing the group that did most of the work to put this report together, the Working Party on Nuclear Energy Economics. This is a part of the Nuclear Development Committee of the NEA, and perhaps for some of you who are not familiar with the NEA, I should give you a bit of an introduction. The NEA this year is 60 years old. Over the last 60 years, the NEA has supported member countries to deliver authoritative data and analysis on the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. The NEA is the only intergovernmental body that brings together experts from the countries with the deepest experience and capabilities in a broad range of nuclear technology activities, ranging from the Americas, across Europe, Asia, Asia Pacific, Latin America, really across the world. And we work with these countries to achieve a common understanding to advance the state of the art in the application of nuclear energy technology. Representing the world's best nuclear expertise, NEA's membership currently consists of 33 countries, which together make up about 84% of the world's installed nuclear energy generating capacity. This report, The Full Cost of Electricity Provision, examines the cost of different power generation technologies. The costs of electricity are generally accounted for in terms of market prices and plant-level production costs. While both account for an important share of the overall impacts of electricity, there's growing recognition that these are not the whole story. What this report reveals is that using the simple model of levelized cost of electricity, LCOE, a measure of cost for particularly generating technology at the level of a power plant, just provides a small part of the picture and leaves out many decisive aspects. The grid-level system costs and social costs that are not captured by LCOE are too important to be ignored any longer. Policymakers and the public need to be more aware of these costs if they're to make the right, informed decisions along the path towards fully sustainable electricity systems. These impacts are not always captured by market prices. Impacts such as atmospheric pollution, climate change risk, major accidents, or the simple system costs of intermittency are referred to as external costs or social costs. While they do not have the precision of plant-level production costs, researchers can usually identify them, often measure them, and sometimes even tentatively monetize them. Since at least the early 1990s, a broad community of researchers has been carrying out research on full costs, but their findings have not always had the policy impact that they deserve. However, the lack of policy attention does not make the social cost of electricity provision any less significant. Research by the World World Health Organization, WHO, indicates that every year 3 million deaths are caused around the world by ambient air pollution and by particulate matter released mainly through the burning of coal or biomass. Add to this the impact of household air pollution, much of which can be avoided by the provision of clean electricity, and the number of deaths per year rise to over 7 million people. Clearly, all sources of electricity have advantages and drawbacks. However, it would be wrong to think that no distinctions should be made in terms of social costs, and the present report highlights the most important costs. Despite the evident importance of all of the full costs, accounting for them remains very difficult. From researching biophysical dose-response function, calibrating dispersion models, and probabilistic assessments to the contentious issue of monetary valuation, different groups of experts need to be coordinated in a large-scale multi-year effort to arrive at robust results. A large systematic effort goes beyond the scope of this report. Nevertheless, the issue is too important to be disregarded. The NEA therefore took the decision to summarize and synthesize the most recent research in this area. The office of this report has synthesized well-documented information from a wide range of sources. The report has also undergone a very comprehensive review process. Given the uncertainties involved, however, it remains an area where reasonable people can disagree until more detailed information is available. Questions about completeness or even-handedness could thus be starting points for more comprehensive research. As Director General of the NEA, I want to once more express our appreciation to the authors and reviewers that made this report possible. And I will also emphasize the agency's commitment to continuing assisting our member countries in developing policy frameworks that facilitate the creation of safe, environmentally sound, and affordable electricity systems. Reports such as the full cost of electricity provision are part of an ongoing effort to better understand and manage our electricity systems in a time of intense technological, behavior, and institutional change. Research on full costs of energy and electricity is an ongoing effort. We look forward to broadening and deepening this research over the coming years in collaboration with our colleagues at the OECD and the IEA, as well as the wider community of the electricity sector experts and stakeholders. The energy transitions around the world in many member countries are redefining the roles of different technologies such as nuclear, renewables, hydro, coal, and gas. All of these can contribute. However, it's important that the choices our member countries make are on the basis of the most complete set of information available, allowing progress towards more sustainable energy systems. Thank you very much, and I will now give the floor to Jan Keppler.
Thank you, Bill. I want to briefly present to the audience an introduction into the study. In particular, present the different aspects or dimensions of the study that sort of gives a little bit of an intuition for the complexity of social costs. The first domain is the technical and economic domain with the plant-level production costs, the grid-level system costs, employment and growth effects of electricity generation. I'll briefly present those myself. The second domain is the social and environmental domain with issues such as climate change risks, air pollution, the costs of major accidents, land use change, and natural resource depletion. And Kirsty Gogan will speak to those. And then there is the political domain with security of energy and electricity supply, with the importance of research, information, and public discussion. And finally, the policy implications of full cost accounting in the electricity sector. And Matt Crozat will speak to those. Talking about the full costs of electricity, it is always useful to look at this graph with the different cost categories. In the smallest, the dark blue shaded area, we have the plant level production costs at market prices, which correspond to the LCOE, and which you can see is but a small part of the bigger picture. Then we have sort of in the medium shaded area, we have the grid level costs at the level of the electricity system, much of which are due to the variability of renewable sources such as wind and solar PV. And then the light shaded area, that's really the full cost that includes all the social costs, including emissions, land use change, climate change risks, security of supply, and so forth. And the study really tries to sort of use that as its parameter. And of course, we haven't covered every single bit in that study, but sort of give an outline of the whole. One further remark, accounting for full costs is absolutely necessary to inform policymaking and public debate, but it cannot substitute for it, because there is still a margin of uncertainty about it. They are not as precise as market costs and so forth, and that's why social and political discussions will always need to give different weights to different variables and then come to sustainable solutions that are appropriate to each country. In terms of the cost categories that I wanted to present are the plant level production costs, which are measured in LCOE, in fact. And you can see here from a 2015 study, in green we have gas, in gray we have coal-fired power plants, and in blue we have nuclear power plants. And we're presenting the ranges for the different parts of levelized cost of generating electricity at 3%, 7%, and 10% of cost of capital. And what we see is that nuclear, for instance, as a very capital-intensive technology, is very much dependent on the level of the cost of capital. At 3%, nuclear is very competitive. At 10% of cost of capital, much less so. On the other hand, gas-fired power generation, where a large part of costs indeed are due to the fuel cost, doesn't change at all, or changes very little, in fact, with the cost of capital. We can compare this to renewable plants, and this is a slightly different scale. So on average in 2015, renewable production, even by per megawatt hour, without accounting for system costs or other, was still considerably more expensive. You have in green, mauve, and gray, you have the solar PV plants. Green would be the small-scale household level. The mauve ones, intermediate, medium-sized commercial level. And the gray bar would be large-scale utility size PV plants. Light blue would be offshore wind, which indeed sometimes is already competitive with conventional power plants in terms of LCOE, and in dark blue, offshore wind, which is still somewhat more expensive. Again, you see the same effect as we saw with nuclear. Low carbon technologies indeed are very much dependent on the cost of capital. Let me briefly comment on the grid level system costs. As I said, they are mainly due to the variability and to the dispersed nature of renewable energy sources. That's why we calculate them for 10% and for 30% of variable renewable generation. They can be substantial. They range, according to our calculations, between $15 and $40 per megawatt hour, which would need to be added to the standard LCOE. And they're currently not internalized. And they're composed of the connection cost, because of the diffuse nature, the added cost for the transportation and the distribution grid, the cost for balancing due to the uncertainty of renewable production, and finally, the most interesting part perhaps, the utilization or the profile cost, which basically calculate how much more expensive the system as a whole becomes due to the variability in order to provide the same service. That brings me to the end of my introductory remarks, and I'll give the floor and the micro to Kirsty Gogan, who will speak on full cost in the social and environmental domain. Kirsty, to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here for the launch of this important report, and thank you very much to Mr. Magwood and Mr. Horst Keppler for the opportunity to comment. So Energy for Humanity is focused on two of the great challenges that we face in this century, which is reducing emissions and tackling air pollution whilst increasing supply to meet rising global energy demand. By 2040, the IEA predicts that world energy demand will have increased by 37%, and the majority of this increased demand is from non-OECD countries, primarily China and India. Meanwhile, in OECD countries, demand is broadly flat and may even fall slightly due to energy efficiency improvements. Meanwhile, an estimated 1.2 billion people remain without electricity, and 2.7 billion rely on traditional biomass such as dung or charcoal for cooking, putting their health at risk. New UN targets aim to achieve universal access to energy by 2030, although universal access is still really defined at quite a low level, certainly much lower than the norm in developed countries. Meanwhile, 2.7 billion use smoky fuels to light and heat their homes and cook over fires fueled by wood and dung or charcoal, and the health consequences of this are severe. The World Health Organization estimates that indoor air pollution causes 4.3 million premature deaths per year, 1 million cases of chronic lung disease, and half of all pneumonia deaths among children under the age of 5. Meanwhile, as countries develop and people gain access to electricity, indoor air pollution is displaced outside as major infrastructure develops to power our modern lives, not only for electricity but also for transport, for industry, for heat, largely by burning fossil fuels, coal and oil, as well as biomass, causing an epidemic of air pollution that now contributes to an additional 3 million deaths per year, according to the World Health Organization. So this combined impact of indoor and outdoor air pollution is causing more than 7 million early deaths per year and contributes to what the WHO calls the world's largest single environmental risk. Few risks have greater impact on global health today than air pollution. The evidence signals a need for concerted action to clean up the air that we breathe, says the director of the World Health Organization's Department of Public Health, Maria Neira. However, it isn't all bad. Emission rates for all air pollutants have fallen remarkably over the past few decades in OECD countries, including emissions from electricity production, largely brought about by a combination of stricter emissions limits and air quality standards, as well as switching away from coal towards nuclear, wind, solar, natural gas, and less sulfurous coal. Still, impacts remain significant. Research finds that electricity power generation causes about 52,000 early deaths per year in the United States, where by comparison, road transport causes around 53,000 deaths per year. Meanwhile, diesel engines in transport are a major source of ground-level ozone in Europe and in the US. So while indoor air pollution is almost exclusively an issue for non-OECD countries, the latter also carry the principal burden of ambient air pollution. The WHO estimates that 87% of deaths due to ambient air pollution occur in those low to middle-income countries. Nevertheless, a considerable number of people are exposed to ambient air pollution also in OECD countries. The OECD estimates that the welfare costs of these lives that are lost due to ambient air pollution in 2015 could be as high as $1.4 trillion per year in OECD countries and a further $3.2 trillion at the global level. So this progress comes at a price. So in addition to air pollution caused by burning fossil fuels, primarily coal and oil, it's also causing climate change. A change in the climate system at a speed and scale that's unprecedented in Earth's history. Average global temperatures have already risen by 1 degree since the Industrial Revolution, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Fifth Assessment Report has concluded that it is extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of global warming, particularly emissions of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. This means that by 2050, the world needs to cut emissions to around half of today's levels in order to have a chance of keeping global mean temperature increases to 2 degrees. Beyond that threshold, scientists say severe and irreversible changes are likely. So if every country met the pledges that it's made to date through the Paris Accord, we'd still be looking at a rise in emissions. Average global temperatures would likely rise between 3 to 4 degrees by 2100, depending on your level of optimism or pessimism, compared to a 6-degree increase with no action. The reality today is that after a 2-year pause, carbon emissions have started rising again. Such rapid destabilizing of our climate system will cause enormous disruption for humans and nature. Anticipated effects include rising sea levels, threatening coastal cities around the world, changing precipitation, expansion of deserts. Warming will be greater on land than in the sea, and greatest of all in the Arctic, causing glaciers to retreat, melting permafrost and sea ice, releasing large quantities of methane, multiplying the greenhouse effect. Ice shelves several times the size of Manhattan are crumbling already from the coastal shelf as the air and the sea warm. Other likely changes include frequent extreme weather events such as heat waves, droughts, heavy rainfall with floods, ocean acidification, and potentially a catastrophic mass species extinction by the end of the century. Effects on humans include the threat to food security from decreasing crop yields, forced migration, the abandonment of densely populated cities due to rising sea levels. The World Economic Forum Annual Global Risk Register lists climate change as a growing problem, and that's because the ways that carbon pollution is altering the climate are strongly interconnected with other risks, such as conflict and migration. How do we quantify the costs of these impacts? Climate is a cumulative problem. People think that they can wait until it's got bad and then look out the window and then say, okay, it's bad now, let's solve it. But it doesn't work that way, because by then it will be too late, because the climate system has a large inertia and greenhouse gases will remain in the atmosphere for a long time. Many of these effects will persist not only for decades or centuries, but tens of thousands of years to come. So these far-reaching impacts make understanding and measuring the impacts of climate change really complex and difficult. It's really complex and difficult to set appropriate targets and assess these costs, to mitigate, to build resilience, and then to adapt. However, tackling the cause at its source is relatively straightforward. As the late, great Professor Sir David Mackay said, the climate problem is mostly an energy problem. So broadly speaking, solving climate change can be boiled down to a simple 2-step strategy: clean up electricity generation, and then electrify everything as efficiently as possible. And where we can't electrify, then we're going to need clean technologies that can decarbonize heat and manufacture synthetic fuels in order to decarbonize the transport fleet. So carbon taxes, meaning an appropriate price of CO2 emissions, they could drive a wedge between the cost of those fossil fuel-based power generation and low-carbon technologies that we need to replace fossil fuels, such as nuclear and hydro and renewables. But these measures tend to be vigorously resisted by both fossil fuel producers and then, of course, to a lesser extent by electricity consumers, resenting the increase in their electricity bills. So in this situation, supporting low-carbon electricity generation rather than the carbon-intensive taxation could be an economically sound alternative. But from an economic point of view, carbon taxes remain a first best instrument, also because it's easily implemented across all sectors of the economy. So we've talked about the costs of air pollution and climate change and how these really constitute the most important social cost issue in terms of electricity provision. Now, while major accidents are closely followed by policymakers and the general public alike, actual costs are comparatively low, as we can see if we read Chapter 6 in the report today. So why is it that people think that pretty much the safest form of electricity generation is the most dangerous? Of course, nuclear power isn't infinitely dangerous. It's just dangerous, much as coal mines and petrol repositories and fossil fuel burning and wind turbines are dangerous. In fact, nuclear energy is actually far safer than coal and natural gas in terms of its life cycle impacts, and is actually similar to offshore wind in terms of deaths and injuries from accidents. Likewise, it just takes a moment's reflection to realise that, sadly, fossil fuel energy production has a cost in lives that's far greater than nuclear. Just think of disasters on oil rigs, helicopters lost at sea, pipeline fires, refinery explosions, coal mine accidents, not to mention the millions of deaths from air pollution each year, as well as the impacts on health, well-being, longevity, and quality of life associated with having little or no electricity at all. So even if we have no guarantee against accidents in future, I think now the right way to assess the risks from our electricity provision and the associated costs from those accidents and public health impacts is to look at those risks in context and make a full assessment of the costs and benefits associated with them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. We'll indeed move on to Matt Crozat, who will speak to the full costs and the political domain and the policy conclusions. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you to the NEA for accommodating my participation from afar. I come to you as the longtime chair of the Working Party on Nuclear Energy Economics, and this work today is something that has been a great point of interest and pride in my time working with the NEA. In particular, the NEA has done a remarkable job of gathering talent that can look at the economics of energy issues and apply it to nuclear energy broadly. What's so strong about this work is it looks at how nuclear fits as part of a complex system with other technologies and a broader policy needs. But I think along these lines, we can sometimes get lost a bit in the language of what's really being conveyed. Let me take this first slide as my point. There's a word here, uninternalized, that I think captures a lot of what the report is trying to convey, but I don't know that we do a good enough job of conveying what is being covered there. A lot of what we're getting at here is what is covered by markets. What are markets telling us, and how do we react to these price signals? So the internalized factors that we're looking at here is, well, what are the costs of generation? How do consumers react to those costs and those prices to then translate that into decisions about how they're going to use energy and how much and when? As we look at these issues, the question then is, okay, well, what is being captured by those market prices? There's a line in the report that really stood out to me. It said, the different chapters in the report converge on one single insight. The external costs of normal operations of electricity generation exceed the costs of other phases of the life cycle of electricity generation. That's actually a really important statement that I think can get lost in the language. What that's saying is, if we look at everything that's important from our energy system, market prices are capturing less than what they're missing. The challenge that we have then is, for all of these other factors, these external costs, we need a policy framework that either brings those costs into the market context or finds other ways to address them. And that's where I think that the policy issues come to bear. As we look towards these large costs that are not being captured, air pollution, climate change, energy security, Jan focuses on this notion of attention bias. And I think that is important to understand how our policymakers struggle with addressing these issues. When we think about things like the health impacts of energy use, it can be a very abstract concept. Thousands of lives lost, some distant, spread across some distant geographic range over a long time horizon at times. Policymakers, I think, have an easier time addressing things like job impacts, job losses. That's tangible and is real. But what I find interesting, especially in the US, as we've seen these issues come to bear, when it comes time to actually craft the policy, the focus is more on what are the external costs of the technologies and how do I capture it? How are zero emission credits used to preserve nuclear plants, for example? Let me go to the next slide. I could. We also know that accounting for these issues can be very difficult. The uncertainties around them can be significant. Energy security is discussed in the report, and it does a very good job of trying to measure in a reasonable way what energy security looks like. What it doesn't do is provide a straightforward method to then translate that into a market price. And this is where I think some of the struggle comes in. We know that societal choices can make a difference on how these factors are translated in the market and in policy as well. Pointing out that different technologies have different profiles of external costs does not imply that there's no role for them, but that as we try to assess what the appropriate role is, we must do a better job of ensuring that we're accounting for everything that's important in this context. What I'd like to do is step back as I think about the policy here. And, Bill opened up by pointing out this is the 60th year of the NEA. And as I think about the history of the OECD more broadly, I think it's safe to say that the OECD has helped to foster the idea that markets are an important way to organize economic activity, that it provides the signals for producers and consumers to have the appropriate incentives for consumption and production of goods and services. And this is very well grounded in social science and academic research. But I think electricity was one of the later markets to develop, and in no small part because it is technically complicated. The challenge of having to match supply and demand every minute of every hour across broad geographies was a technological feat to even be able to do that. What we're grappling with now is how do we create the right incentives to ensure that the electricity that we're using meets the needs that we're facing today. I think the frustration that we see in many places as we see market forces reshape the technologies being used in the portfolio is based upon the idea that markets are not doing a good enough job of capturing all these other issues that this report is trying to convey. But in defense of markets, I think in many cases, they weren't designed to do that. They were designed to create the lowest cost, most efficient production of electricity with a portfolio of plants that existed. I think they did a pretty good job of that. But as we now move to these next phases and recognize how these other factors come into play, policymakers have this challenge in front of them, that these issues are complex, they're important, and they're also being underappreciated in how we currently value electricity in our systems. The issue, I think, comes down to policymakers need to find ways to either complete the market by bringing these factors into markets, the pricing signals, or it needs to limit what the market is trying to accomplish. With that, let me turn it back to Jan, and we can take questions and complete the discussion there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Matt, joining us from Washington, D.C. for this intervention. But I'll hand over to Mr. Magwood, who will actually chair the discussion and the Q&A session.
Well, again, thank you to all the speakers for this important discussion. Let me kick off and take since I have the microphone, I will start the conversation with asking a question that I know that many people are thinking about, which is that if you internalize all these costs, the costs of air pollution, of climate change, of accidents and other things, doesn't that lead to a massive increase in the price of electricity, which consumers will then have to deal with? Can you postulate an argument for the public as to why they should pay those high costs just to make it easy for economists to evaluate one electricity source over another? Maybe Jan, you want to take this first.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. And indeed, it's an important question, and I'm sure many people think about it. Let me just, while I have the micro, just also give credit to my co-authors. This is a collaborative effort. I coordinated it. but a number of people who are here with us today contribute to this report. And of course, you find your names in the acknowledgements. On the question of costs, what the full costs of electricity tried to do is precisely to say electricity is much more expensive than what we think. And what Matt pointed out, markets are good at capturing and minimizing one particular aspect of these costs. But there are other costs that are not reflected in markets, but they are nevertheless. So what our approach tries to do, in fact, is to minimize overall costs, but including all these costs that are not included in market costs, such as grid level costs, or grid level system costs, which can be monetized and which can be allocated, which can also be reduced from the level what they are currently, such as social costs, which are a bit more difficult because they have this complexity and the large ranges, but they're nevertheless real costs. Kirsty spoke very eloquently of the health costs and the impacts of the different energy chains, and what full costs try to do is in fact minimize these overall costs. And yes, Kirsty, perhaps you could continue.
Oh, well, thank you. I was, the first point is absolutely that we're paying the costs already one way or another through those public health impacts and those climate impacts and those other social environmental impacts that are covered in the report. If we are to internalize those costs into the fossil fuel infrastructure and move towards clean electricity generation, then really the big priority must be to drive down the cost of that clean electricity generation. And we can do that by, by a concerted effort on innovation and cost reduction. We're already seeing very competitive nuclear new build in parts of the world where an intentional program has been developed with cost reduction absolutely at its heart, delivering competitive, clean, reliable, affordable electricity to in very large volumes to citizens of those countries. And the question is, how can we scale up that clean electricity generation in wind, solar, nuclear, and other sources throughout the world?
Matt, would you like to comment?
Yes. I think this is an important question. And while I agree with everything that both Kirsty and Jan said, I do want to come back to the political framing that Bill had as well, which is if we look at the idealized answer of internalizing everything at once, that is probably politically challenging to say the least. So the question then becomes, to my mind, what are the second best options that can be pursued to at least put us on the right path? I think in the United States, we've seen this take place as a rather piecemeal approach at times. We have 22 states that have carbon reduction goals as part of their state energy plans. Some have been more aggressive on this than others. But as we work towards doing a better job of internalizing or at least shaping these policy environments, I think there needs to be a recognition that if the idealized can't be attained, the next question becomes, what is the appropriate set of second best options to at least get us on the right track and begin working on part of it, as opposed to, in many cases, what we do now, which is in the face of uncertainties, declare that, well, we're not going to address the challenge, which essentially puts a price of zero on whatever that attribute is, be it the energy security or health impacts, which is probably the one estimate that can't be correct.
Thank you. Let me ask you a follow-up question, Matt. And that is, when you think about this subject and this approach of reflecting the full cost of energy provision, do you have I guess, an impression of what the optimal energy mix would be in the future? I mean, where do you think this leads us?
Well, I think it will lead towards an evolution towards lower carbon fuels that, both in terms of the health impacts and the energy security aspects as well. But I don't think we need to be prescriptive, though I will point out that on some level being prescriptive is a way to address this. We've seen renewable portfolio standards in many states that have helped to drive the deployment of renewable technologies. we're now seeing clean energy standards in many places. That if they're saying, if I can't internalize the price, at least I can, in case, divide the market. So I'm trying to have increasing shares work towards a goal. I think from an economics point of view, it's not the ideal answer, but I think it's better than not having an answer.
Kirsty, let me ask you a question, because I know that in your work you look at all the energy sources very carefully. And obviously many countries are working hard to develop policies to enable renewables to be deployed in large numbers. Could one argue that not internalizing the cost of renewables is part of the effort to promote renewables, and if you begin to internalize all the costs of renewables, it might make them too expensive to deploy? Have you considered that?
Yeah, so quite often the climate and energy discourse is really dominated by a technology-specific frame. So whether that's 100% renewables or efficiency, storage, batteries, and actually, you know, the energy system needs to be looked at as a whole system. And certainly what we've seen in countries that have built up large quantities of installed capacity of renewables, they're not necessarily achieving low carbon intensity. So, you know, for us at Energy for Humanity, the goal really has to be carbon reduction and, you know, as well as maintaining all of those other energy services that people need in as clean, efficient, affordable, feasible, cost-effective way as possible. So we don't focus so much on specific technologies, rather on the performance of the whole system. What we're seeing in Europe is that those countries that are climate leaders are achieving that with a combination of zero carbon baseload, primarily through nuclear, with a combination of renewables. And that's how you achieve good carbon reduction. If you take out nuclear from the equation, you have to replace it generally with fossil fuels. And therefore, we're certainly not internalizing the real system costs if you just focus on renewables alone.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me pass along one of the questions that we received on the web, and this relates to the cost associated with past nuclear events, particularly those that have led to contamination in the landscape, for example. So the question basically is that how do we calculate the numbers of deaths due to nuclear contamination? There's a wide range of numbers associated with this, and the questioner wants to know, you know, how did the study approach this, and what kinds of numbers were used? And perhaps, I don't know, maybe Matt or Jan, one of you would like to try to address that.
Yes, thank you, Bill. The study has one chapter indeed on the costs of major accidents. Major accidents were defined as accidents that had a number of deaths greater than 5. We did not monetize these deaths, although that is in principle possible in nuclear accidents as in other accidents. There is a measure called the statistical value of life, and economics has some techniques to arrive that. They have their uses, but I think a number of impacts in pure lives lost is already quite a valuable information. In principle, there's no difference in assessing accidents for nuclear than accidents for other resources, for other technologies, other than, in fact, nuclear has also some impacts that we call latent, basically an increase in cancer rates over time, which might sort of only manifest themselves after years or decades. We've looked at those. We've reported some numbers. They are serious, but they're usually less than the really dramatic impacts, or considerably less, in fact, than the dramatic impacts of air pollution, for instance. They are an order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitudes lower than those. So yes, the study has looked at those, has reported some numbers, And if you look at the study, you'll find more information on that.
Matt, did you want to make a comment on that?
No, I think that covered what I was going to say too, so thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, Kirsty.
One very quick comment just to say that the most dangerous nuclear power station is the one that doesn't get built.
Thank you.
Because a coal-fired power station will be probably built instead.
Another question from the web. This one I think I'm going to ask Jan to comment on because it's really more as a general economic question. And the question is electricity production unique in not internalizing its cost? Are there other elements of markets where we don't see cost fully internalized? Is electricity just somehow a strange part of our society where we don't internalize its costs? Or is this something we see more generally throughout markets?
That is a very interesting question and could really be discussed at length. To some extent, of course, the phenomenon of social cost is not confined to the electricity sector. We can think of areas such as, well, transport, I wanted to say, but of course you're in the energy sector immediately again. You could think of chemical production or other things. There are some externalities, but it is true that the discussion of social costs and externalities has traditionally, historically, very close links with the energy and the electricity sector. Historically, the first examples around the turn of the century by Pigou was already burning of coal, creating external effects by fires caused by trains passing through the countryside. So there is a strong link there. I think it has something to do with that energy systems were planned for a long time with large subsidies, with a lot of government support, with pursuing public good objectives, and that sort of a lot of sort of side effects that would have been automatically internalized for lesser industry were sort of a little bit sort of pushed to the side, and then later on came to the fourth, and then there's then a strange counter effect that it being a large industry, large centralized industry, with a lot of public attention being lavished on it, also sort of then the attention on the external effects sort of was perhaps somewhat greater than other industries. But that's a very long, interesting discourse. The short answer is it's not limited in principle, but yes, traditionally there has been some link.
Yes, please, Kirsty.
Just very briefly, so Bill Gates said that the number one thing that you can do to tackle poverty is give people access to electricity. So that's one reason why this report is fundamentally important. The other reason is that if climate change, which is one of the great existential threats that we face in this century, is fundamentally an energy problem, then solving it will mean very large-scale electrification. Then this study is absolutely, critical, and it comes at a very important time for us to consider what the full costs are of electricity provision.
Thank you. Kirsty, since you have the microphone in hand, you can pick it up again because I have a question specifically for you. Excuse me. And this gets back to the discussion we were having earlier about the health impact of nuclear accidents. One of the questioners points out that nuclear accidents have more impact on social costs than simply fatalities. As I think the tables in the report point out, the number of fatalities is actually quite small, vanishingly small in some cases. But the questioner points out that a study by France's IRSN a few years ago found that the non-health impacts of a major nuclear accident, including commercial impacts, could vastly outweigh the health impacts. And for example, how do you account for psychological impacts? And perhaps you can comment on that.
Yeah, this is so important. So I first looked at this issue when I was asked by the UK government to review the national communications response to Fukushima. And in doing that, the first thing that I did was I read all of the United Nations, World Health Organization, and UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation reports from Chernobyl. And I was quite new to nuclear then, and I realized reading these reports something extremely surprising, which was that by far the greatest public health impact from the accident at Chernobyl had been the trauma and the experience of the response to the accident, much more so than radiation itself. In fact, fear of radiation is much more harmful than radiation itself. And so the question that's being asked is a really important one, because actually it's about how we respond to these accidents. And the truth is that the way that we respond to, the way that we assess risk in the nuclear sector is completely in an order of magnitude difference in proportion to the way that we assess risk for any other kinds of electricity provision. Again, which is why this report is so important, because it puts all of these risks into context so that we can assess all of those risks in context and find actually that the public health impacts immediately from other sources are much more serious. Oh, Jan, do you want to add?
That's fine.
I'm going to pick on you one more time, Kirsty. This is 3 in a row for you, but because I have a question about this, because something you said keyed this in my mind, and it actually relates to a question we received, and that is this issue about the estimating these social costs. As Jan pointed out in his presentation, is very difficult. It's hard to get specific estimates. So as we go forward with this, how do we really reflect those in our behavior? How do we take account for these social costs when they're so difficult to estimate? It's easy for us to sit here and say there's a report to say that someone somewhere should calculate these and incorporate these costs, but if we don't have the data, how do we approach that? And to give you an example where this is troublesome people, one of the questions we received here reflects on something you said about the loss of species. And this person asked, well, shouldn't that be an infinite cost if you lose species? And that's something that sort of drives other options off the table. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so, well, one of my mottos is don't cry, work. So we just have to keep working, and we have to, keep getting better and doing better. And we are, today humans live safer, more comfortable, longer, healthier, more productive lives than ever before. Global well-being for women and children is rising around the world. Literacy rates are rising. Progress is happening, but it isn't inevitable. So we do need to keep striving. How do we take into account these social costs? We need to constantly innovate, constantly collaborate, constantly find ways to drive down costs associated with cleaner, better technology. And, crucially for the nuclear industry specifically, for example, on this question of, the way that we respond to nuclear accidents, the response to nuclear accidents right now is dominated by radiological protection. We need to broaden that risk assessment and really take into account the very severe health and psychological effects that our actions could have on people, and reassess. It takes courage to change the way that we do things, and that's what we need at this moment in time.
Jan, did you want to comment on this question of social costs?
Yes, and I think one important aspect, just to underline something Kirsty said, is really social costs, both learning about them and internalizing them, really takes place through time. And to some extent studying them and learning about them and quantifying them and in some parts monetizing them is already part of the process. And I think if all social costs were known with certainty, then the legal system would already sort of internalize them. But they're not. But that doesn't mean that they don't exist. So we're in this dynamic stage, and then policy comes in, and at the beginning these are sort of marginal people. Then it becomes sort of a general problem. Then it goes into the mainstream. Then science is being done. And then finally it gets integrated into the policy process. And we sort of need to push that chain at each and every single point, which means learn more, study better, monetize where you can, push governments and to internalize in terms of different measures. Public opinion can help, the legal system can help. So it's really a broad, dynamic process.
Well, Matt, let me ask you to comment on that, because you're located in Washington, D.C., and these sorts of questions come up from time to time. Do you think policymakers in general are equipped to deal with these questions?
I think that they can be. Actually, let me go back to where you started that question first, Bill. It was in the context of how do you create a policy to address something that's difficult to quantify. And I'd point out that we do this especially in nuclear safety. We have a regulator that says there are standards to which nuclear operations must be held. I don't need to tell you, of course, that there's a great deal of expertise and careful attention that goes into ensuring that the standards that are set and the adherence to those standards is well followed. And so I think that there might be an idealized model here to say, well, everything should be internal to the price, and that's fine. But we do have approaches that are it's a little bit short of the ideal, can go a long way towards ensuring that these costs are being managed and addressed in some way. And then your second point. Part of the challenge that I think that we see here is that there are a lot of dimensions to this problem that are important. And trying to tackle all of them at once is often very challenging from a policymaking point of view. Issues tend to get boiled down to one dimension at a time. So right now in the United States, we have a lot of attention on the idea of a resilient grid, which looks an awful lot like the energy security dimension that was discussed in this report. Where we need to evolve over time is to the point where everything that's important is captured in some way, and preferably at the scale of the challenge that it provides. One of the issues that I think that we're going to see is the need to constantly reassess how well the policy tools that we have are addressing the challenges that we're seeing. We passed the Clean Air Act in 1973. How well is that tool fitting the challenges of today, what we now know about the air quality impacts on health? They need to sort of constantly reevaluate as something that can be a challenge. That once a question has been addressed, it doesn't mean it goes away forever. And so it will be a constant challenge for those of us working in this area to both generate that kind of attention on these issues and ensure that it's not lost over time.
Thank you very much, Matt. With that, I've just been signaled that we are out of time. I'm afraid we'll have to wrap it up here because we have just a few minutes before we go offline. So let me take the opportunity to thank you, Matt, for joining us from Washington with your comments. Jan, for your hard work with working with the group and producing this report, as long as the other staff who are watching here today, Professor Rothwell and Marco Caminetto and others that worked on this. It's really a team effort, along with our colleagues in the OECD and the IEA. And Kirsty, again, thank you for being with us here today. And I will hand it back to Andrew to wrap us up.
Thank you again to our speakers for their presentations and to all of you who've attended this webcast today. We'd like to remind you that the report is available online and can be downloaded on the NEA website at www.oecd-nea.org. For more updates and news, we also encourage you to follow us on social media on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you.